Yes, I am a GIS analyst at Clark County, Washington. And so if you're not actively working in the world of asset management, you're still in the right place, because I'm going to keep things really basic. It's like me watching YouTube videos of NFTs or people explaining offsides penalty in soccer. They don't really relate to me, and I don't really care about them, but I keep watching them so I can impress my cube mate. So at a minimum, you'll be able to impress your coworkers that are tasked with asset management after this presentation. So years ago at the ESRI user conference in San Diego, I attended a workshop called Using GIS for Asset Management. And so the crowds were spilling into the halls, and I realized that this wasn't just a hot topic for me. I had just gotten thrown into the GIS lead position with our county's public works department, and they were standing up an asset and maintenance management program. So taking on this new role in an unfamiliar space, I did what most people do, and I Googled asset management. And the results I got were similar to the user conference presentations. There was a lot of high-level discussion telling me why asset management was so important. And here are some products that will do it all for you. A lot of people selling their wares. But looking back, I was looking for more of a down in the weeds discussion. And so this is my attempt to give a presentation I wish I could have attended. So explaining asset management at the 101 level. So, and at the end of this, I'll have a quick case study using ESRI apps to tie everything together. And let's see here, next slide. Sorry about that, technical difficulties. Right, so a recurring theme throughout this presentation is the difference between asset management and maintenance management. While most people use this term interchangeably, they're more hand in glove. So for most people, MMS is just a component of a full-featured asset management program. CityWorks, Cartograph, AssetWorks are common software, full-featured software solutions. Clark County, unfortunately, or maybe fortunate for me, bought only a maintenance management solution. So the employees kept calling it an asset management system, but it was not. It only did maintenance management. So I learned a lot between the differences of those two. And so let's start with what maintenance management is. So in a nutshell, MMS, or maintenance management, is a way to record maintenance activities. So it's up to the user or the organization to see how much they're going to use it and how they're going to use it. I came up with 3 levels of how people apply the MMS system. And because it's my classification scheme, I came up with names for each class. So first is the most elementary use of maintenance management is creating work orders. So we have groups at Clark County that are stuck at this level today, where they're just tracking labor. The supervisor creates a work order, assigns it to an employee, the crew member goes out, does the work, they close it. Okay, you're doing things, but you're not really accomplishing anything. So it's nothing really meaningful. So I call that the Seinfeld level of maintenance management. Okay, the next step is to do work orders, but this time you're actually attaching an asset to the work order. So a specific guardrail or a curb ramp to the work order. Over time, this builds asset maintenance history. So you're really starting to pull things together. You're leveraging the software like you're supposed to. So that is the Lebowski level of pulling things together. All right, the final step in asset is asset inspections. So that's where you're attaching an asset to an inspection record, very similar to a work order. And over time, you're creating asset inspection history to go along with your maintenance history. So now you're doing all 3 of these things. You've completed the MMS trifecta. So I call this the full Monty, and I think I have a slide for that. Wait for it. There we go. All right, so a fully functional MMS will also have a component for preventative maintenance and reporting tools. It's important to bring those on board as well. And both of those require assets in the system to work correctly, but I would say that's more downstream of GIS involvement. And finally, when you hear material inventory, just think warehouse inventory. It's a separate configuration in my experience. GIS really doesn't get involved with that. Okay, so this rounds out what most people would call a full feature maintenance management system. And if you notice that the first four bullet points there require assets in the system to work correctly. So you really need assets to get past the Seinfeld level of use. All right, so let's do a quick pivot to asset management, which is actually upstream from maintenance management. So this is my attempt to kind of tease apart the differences between the two. And the blue text is really intrinsic to a GIS. So the concept that we really messed up on was the second bullet point, and that's where we started to treat defects or statements of condition as attributes. So we embedded 10 or 12 different condition items into our guardrail feature class, and these should have been separated, pulled completely apart as defects that belong in an inspection. And it was one of those light switch moments after we had deployed the solution that we had made a mistake, and we separated attributes and defects in our future workflows. So there's two schools of thought of what is an asset. Okay, now before you grab a pillow, I promise some gratuitous use of the word fungible to help keep you alert. So most transportation assets are fungible, or they're abstracted, okay? Like a stop sign, they're replaceable and interchangeable. Nobody cares about the sheet of metal, at least at Clark County. Nobody cares about the sheet of metal. The ID, the serial number stays with the location. And can retain so that the location can retain inspection and work order history, right? So if there's an accident, you know the history of the maintenance of the sign. Okay, so a crew comes with a sign plate. They take the one that's got graffiti off. Nobody cares where that sign plate goes. Nobody cares where the sign plate came from, but they care about it now that it's installed. Okay, so that makes it a fungible asset. So there are still plenty of non-fungible assets as well, but these are generally high-value assets like signal heads, traffic controllers. They're managed specifically and require location history because they can bounce between locations after scheduled maintenance back at a shop. So this is a more complex form of asset management, and we do not have a successful example of that at Clark County, but we are planning for it, and the plan is to use a relationship to permanent assets like a signal pole or a mast arm, signal cabinets for location. So in my opinion, you should really have a good reason to track an asset in a non-fungible manner. So at Clark County, we bought a MMS system and realized after the fact that we needed assets in it to work properly. And we needed those assets quickly, right? You're under pressure. Management's like, hey, you spent all this money. Why aren't you using it? All right. So we wound up using 4 methods to populate assets. And as a GIS person, I probably could have overlooked the first 2 if they weren't brought to my attention. And Clark County has a lot of tabular data and that had some locational component to it. Most are route-based events, linear point, milepost, route numbers that we could generate mapped data from. Some databases had an XY coordinate. Okay, so we were able to script updates from these, download them in the GIS, and then push those assets into the MMS system. However, because we didn't have data, because the data was readily available and we needed to show progress, we just pushed assets into the MMS system without a lot of forethought. So for example, we had the fuel and gas tax database, which, well, there's a lot of Washington State people here. So it's the CRAB, County Road Administration Board. formerly known as the mobility data, I believe, as of like last week. But those records included curbs and sidewalks. Okay, to date, no one has generated a work order against a curb or a sidewalk. So there was a disconnect with how crew supervisors understood assets and how they were going to assign work orders to them. And I think this could have been avoided if the handful of public works MMS managers would have attended a presentation like this one. So now I know it sounds like I'm throwing people under the bus, but I was in the room too, and I was doing my best deer in the headlights impersonation. So we also had tabular data with no locational component. So here we used kind of a hybrid thing where the person would go out with a collector, they'd map the feature, and they'd have a list of IDs, and they would only attribute, there's only one value that they attributed, and that was the ID that would link back to the other database that had no locational component. And as most of you know, once you have a matching ID between data sets, you can do pretty much anything. And then obviously we used just a complete out-of-the-box solution from ESRI with collector to map assets in the field. And finally, we had a traditional heads-up digitizing as well from photography and as-builts. So I touched on this earlier, but we had a manager level disconnect between assets pushed into the maintenance management system and the maintenance tasks goals. So, and no one has ever generated a work order, or at least a meaningful one, against 10 or 12 different asset classes in our current MMS system. So as an example, we mapped every garbage can in the county parks. And this was our third foray into MMS to go with stormwater assets and transportation assets. And so I was pretty savvy at this point. So I asked the manager, like, do you really expect a crew member to select on a map all of the garbage cans after they were emptied? Ignore the ones you didn't empty, but select all the ones that you did empty and add them to the work order. And well, we wound up mapping them anyway, and we added them to MMS, and guess what? There are no work orders ever generated against them. All of the work orders were linked to an asset, but that asset was the park polygon, okay? So you think of it as these very specific silos out to a larger silo of what you're applying your work towards. So the key step that we kept missing was first, figure out how you want to quantify your labor and then work backwards. Let that drive the asset collection and what gets included into MMS. And it didn't end at garbage cans. We have a very rich asset environment for parks. And this is helpful for managers at the asset management level, but it turned out to be completely worthless at the maintenance management level. So a couple of lessons here. It's okay to record and map assets, but just don't add them to the MMS system if you're not going to track labor against them. Figure out how far your group will realistically drill down, again, those maintenance silos when charging labor to assets. So for example, the park manager wanted to drill down through the park, theoretically, to the playground, to the swing set, to the seat on the swing set. He actually brought that up in a meeting. And he walked away from that approach because I think it was a solution in search of a problem. So yes, there would be benefit, but how do you leverage that benefit? Will you take the time to leverage it? What are the costs and basically time? And will it justify that benefit? And one final thought, because we only had an MMS system, managers tried to use it as an asset management system unsuccessfully. So I think there was a misunderstanding of MMS driving their decision-making for what goes into the system. In the first place, I was getting questions, give me numbers. And it's like, well, I can give you maintenance history in your MMS system, right? I can give you inspection history, but I can't give you like number of picnic tables in a park, right? The asset management system or a GIS solution can handle that really well, opposed to the MMS system. Okay, so I have a cradle to grave solution here that I've provided for a couple of asset types, but today I'm going to talk specifically about pavement markings. So pavement markings, to be clear, are turn arrows, crosswalks, stop bars, bike symbols, and not to be confused with striping, lane striping. So I work directly with the crew supervisor on this solution, and got my advertisement here for next adventure. Oh, and Samantha wanted me to bring up Ski Bowl too. So I worked with the supervisor on this solution, and it was the first time I feel like we really got everything right. The supervisor used a portal web map and collector to map and attribute the marking assets. So when the user was in the field, they wanted to capture the condition of the asset at the same time. So at this point, I learned my lesson from guardrails and decided not to spin off a separate application for inspections. But it raises the question, how do you tie an inspection to a newly created feature? Okay, the separate application I used was Survey 123. I configured a custom pop-up and collector, and the key here is I had the ability to embed the brand new features global ID into the survey as the foreign key. The custom pop-up call to Survey 123 is probably one of the most underappreciated, under-advertised functionality in our GIS collector. It's something Samantha, who is the moderator, actually had mastered in our office on an earlier project, and I was fortunate that she shared it with me. So the user can click on the inspection form after clicking on a pavement marking, and that is calling the code in the custom pop-up. So there's your application, that's the ID for the survey, and then you have the global ID, which is dynamic based on what you click on the map. And that throws you right into Survey 123, pops to the forefront. Again, pretty simple survey here, just what's the condition of your pavement marking. And at this point, the new Survey 123 feature class record already has the pavement markings global ID embedded in it, okay? Again, if you've got matching IDs, you can do a lot. So to track inspection progress in collector, as most of you know, Survey 123 uses a separate feature class, and that point location out in the field with an iPad's GPS could be 20 or 30 feet away from the pavement markings location. But because I was able to push the foreign key with the inspection, I was able to create a spatial view in SDE to mash together the condition value and the features geometry. Essentially, I'm throwing away the survey's location completely and just replacing it with the features location using a join. So this results in a more refined map with real-time inspection tracking. At night, the Survey 123 inspection records get pushed to our MMS system to preserve inspection history, something we talked about earlier. So now for the big payoff, the actual maintenance activities that make our lives better so that we know we're in a turn lane. So the supervisor is able to ID features in poor condition based on the symbology and quickly add them to a work order. Right? Using that work order, field crews know exactly which markings need to be repainted. When that work order is closed, I capture this event from the MMS database, and I'm free to assume that the marking has been completely repainted and is as good as new. So an overnight script will change the condition of the Survey 123 feature class to new if the work order has been closed. And again, I can do this because the inspection records were safely archived where they belong into the MMS system for inspection history. Okay, so now the inspection layer kind of becomes this dual purpose layer where it reacts to inspections, or actually the feature gets created by the inspection, but it also responds to maintenance activities as well. So you can see this is end of the year, end of season. So everything should be green for the most part, saying that it's as good as new. Apparently there's a national paint shortage on reflective paint for lane markings. Well, something new to panic by, I guess. All right, so on the new year, we hit a giant reset button. And this is a real cool part of the workflow because we can leverage it as seasonal work. Something that you probably can't do in Southern California, Texas, or Florida, but we can do it here, so it lends itself really well. So what happens on the reset? Well, when the new year comes around, background process, again, Python script, probably the same one that does all the other stuff, checks the year, sees that it's a new year, and it just deletes all the features out of the survey 1, 2, 3 feature class. And that's it. All of the condition halos disappear, and all the markings are in need of an annual inspection again. Okay, so we have similar versions of this for other asset types as well. And speaking of assets, in the last 10 years, we've gone from no assets in GIS to actively managing a pretty impressive list. Most of them feed into our MMS system. And you drop them onto a map, and it's overwhelming and confusing, probably cause cartographers to freak out, but it's kind of awesome at the same time to see how much stuff is out there. Okay, so the pavement marking app, while it appears simple, hopefully elegant, a lot of thought went into it, and many conversations with the crew supervisor happened. So I could match their workflows and automate as much as possible. And this app was the result of applying a more seasoned approach with a better understanding of asset and maintenance management. All right, questions or comments?
All right, here we go. One question, which MMS was selected by the county?
I didn't want to. So nobody's probably heard of it, but it's called MainStar. And I think it was developed like in PowerShell or something. We wound up devising a lot of front-end solutions ourselves that just pushed information into the database. And it's almost like we bought a database and not so much a front end, but it's called MainStar.
Great, thank you. All right, from David in the chat, we just have a comment. You can also create a web map pop-up and pass it to survey 123. Super helpful for linking surveys with existing asset locations. I think that ties back nicely with what you were talking about with setting up in collector to spin off to survey 123. And in your example, you use the global ID. I know you've also done some work with spinning up new inspections or new assets, I believe, in like a field mapping application and attaching them to information using an actual ID, not just the global ID. Do you have any tips and tricks or thoughts to share with people on that workflow?
Was it an actual ID?
Yeah.
Which one are you thinking of exactly, Samantha?
Well, maybe not then.
Well, I mean, if the ID already exists, I think to go down in the weeds here a little bit, the asset, I can't use the global ID inside of the maintenance management system because the global ID is just too big, right? So I have to get it down to about 20 characters. So I do, in that same Python script, I am creating a brand new asset ID or facility ID. But that has to happen at night, right? We're not quite at the point where we've got attribute rules that are handling that for us just yet. And obviously, I'm talking about stuff that's been, slowly developed over the last 5 years, right? So we haven't really made that leap into pro back then, and we're slowly migrating stuff to that level now.
All right, great. Well, thank you for that insight. I think that's all we have for questions right now. Matt, a lot of people do come back here and review the presentation. So if you want to jump back into the Q&A on the Whova app at any time. So for anyone out there watching, if you want to come back and add questions as you think of them throughout the conference as well, do feel free to post them to this section because the presenters can always come back and answer later.
Okay, sounds good. And just to plug on my bio, there's a YouTube link to the music video that you see a snippet of there on the screen. And if you want to partake, you're welcome to. Remember to smash the like button.
You should go ahead and share that in the chat.
Okay, I'll put it in the chat. It's a good idea.
Some great pandemic time commentary for anyone needing a little humor in these days.
That's right, right.
Yeah.
It's Saturday Night Live level of humor for try not to be too offensive with it.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you, Matt.
All right, thanks, Samantha.